We're live. So excited. I'm always excited. I always say that, right? But I am always excited because
You always are.
you don't understand. I love talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And
Me too.
so I am excited to welcome Jodi because Jodi and I have worked together through her business partner, Kelly. And I've known Kelly for many, many years. So today we are going to actually be talking about some of the concepts that come out of our books. Jodi, tell us a little bit, just give us a little bit of your background. Tell us how fabulous you are and tell us a little bit about your second book. Your
Yeah.
second book is called The Next Smart Step. So
Yeah. Throw it up
really
here.
excited
Right
to,
here it is. I don't know if you
yeah,
can see it.
we can, yes. Yeah, so we'll delve into that a little bit. But tell us a little bit about yourself, Jodi.
Sure. So I am Jodi Detjen. I am co-managing partner of Orange Grove Consulting, where we focus on inclusion. And I also am a professor of the practice at Suffolk University in downtown Boston. And so I really focus on the whole idea of how organizations can actually be more effective and really leverage their full capacity of talent that they have. And so I've been doing change management, change leadership, organizational development consulting, and training for like my entire career. And actually, I started off in tech, so I have this little tech side that I love as well. So I think the analytics piece is a key part of it too.
Awesome. Today we're going to be talking about hidden costs, right? Hidden costs of unconscious bias in the workplace, and because we realize that everyone starts talking about the business case, right? And I'm also going to do a little intro because I realize that sometimes people join, and so I hope that if you're joining, that you know who I am. But I am Stacey Gordon, and my company is Rework Work, and we do a lot of work around diversity, equity, inclusion. Really came out of the talent acquisition focus, but realized that while talent acquisition is a huge doorway to change for diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's not the only one. And a lot of times they end up getting scapegoated, right, for lack of progress. So what we do is really look at the holistic, DEI initiatives that people have and see how we can embed those in and turn them from an initiative to part of their strategy. So that is what we do at Rework Work. And it is how I ended up working with Jodi because the work that Jodi does focuses a lot from the gender perspective. And so with a lot of the work that I'm doing, we're focusing in DEI and it ends up coming a lot from the race perspective. So we end up partnering and really being able to look at these numbers and looking at the metrics and seeing where are companies, what's their starting point, right? So to circle back around, the starting point for a lot of people is business case, right? They go, oh, the business case, the business case, the business case, right? The profitability, Deloitte, McKinsey, Harvard Business Review. We've been hit over the head with the statistics around how great that is for the company. But what do we do for the companies that say, well, we're doing well, right? We don't need to worry about changing things up because good enough is good enough.
Yeah, and I think the problem too is that people see these business cases and they look so big. Oh, you can say tens of millions of dollars. And I think the reality is people don't know what to do with it, right? So they have all this business case, but they don't actually know what to do. And I think that's where both of us really help organizations to say, let's peel back the layer. Because the problem is that so many of the cost benefit pieces are actually really hidden. So for example, people might have a retention problem around gender, around race, or any other underrepresented group, and they might not be able, because it seems so individual, that individual chose this way, they may not be quantifying that actually it's a systemic problem that you have. And so because they're not measuring it, they're not actually saying, here's the hidden costs that we're getting hit by, because they're never measuring it. And I'll give you an example. So
Yeah,
working
please
with this.
do. Give us an example.
Sure. Yeah, we're working with this one organization, and there was this story where they had this team that was predominantly female and a team that was predominantly male. And when they looked at the team and how the team was being, what the team was doing and how much visibility these teams were getting, the male team got visibility very quickly in several months. And all of a sudden it was, oh, look what they're doing. And it was up in lights and everything. But the predominantly female team, it took 2 years for them to get any recognition. And both teams were having significant impact on this organization. But because who got the accolades, who got the feedback, who got the recognition was very informally done. People looked around and they tapped the people that they already knew or already had connections with. So think about all that talent loss. So that team that was predominantly women took almost 2 years to get any accolades. So that meant there were motivation hits probably. There were all these impacts that they were having that actually didn't get rolled out to that organization. There was an 18-month differential between those two teams because it was so informally done. Nobody's measuring that cost.
Right.
Nobody's saying, how much did that cost that organization? And then when you think about promotion, in almost every organization that we look at, when you look at velocity of promotion, so how fast people are being promoted, there's always a differential between gender and race and any other underrepresented group, because those that are more visible are people that look like me. So if I have
Right.
a leadership that looks predominantly white male, then those are the people that I'm going to look for in my organization. So now we're perhaps promoting people that aren't as qualified, or as, that we might have a different viewpoint on this. Again, not hidden. Nobody's measuring it. So because it's
Right.
all informally done. So all
Right.
these hidden costs.
Right. So if you're listening and you're in HR or you're a chief diversity officer or you're a hiring manager or you're the CEO, right? And you're wondering to yourself, why are we having this conversation? Why do we need to care, all right, about diversity, equity, inclusion? And that's the question we get a lot. Like, why do we need to care? I think that we have to think about, because we do hear one of the hidden costs that are not so hidden anymore is the retention, right? So in your example, Jodi, of the women who aren't getting the accolades, and it takes an additional 18 months for them to be able to be recognized for the progress they've made, I'm pretty sure some of those women left, right? So you have that process, that problem that is starting to be identified, that we have a retention issue. And so a lot of people will look at their numbers and see, well, we consistently have women leaving after year 4, and they can't figure out why. These are some of the things, right? But this is one that isn't as hidden anymore because people
Yeah.
are paying attention to it. But I think some of the ones that are a little bit more hidden are, as you said, what happens when people stay? We understand the cost when people leave, right? We understand that
Yeah.
we now have to replace them, and we now have a loss because of the gap from the time they've left to the time that we replace them. And now we bring in somebody. It's going to cost us to bring that person in. We have to train that person. It's going to take time for them to get up to speed and to then be a productive member of the company, right? So all of that, cost after cost after cost after cost, right? That's like cost on cost on cost.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
so that's just
Exactly.
in that retention issue. But then what about if they stay? Right?
Well, and you think about it. So I think, so for example, we work with a lot of service companies, so consultancies, architecture, accounting, all those types of very service-based organizations. One of the challenges that they're having is that when they bring a team that's very homogenous to a potential client, that potential client is now looking at the diversity of the team that's showing up and saying, we're not so sure we want to hire an all male team. We want to have diversity across a whole bunch of different ways. So now you can think about the cost of the business loss. We didn't win because we didn't show up with a diverse group of people, or that becomes one of the criteria for a bid. So now what do you do? Because now you're not as competitive. So now you've got revenue loss on top of that. And so I think one of the first things that organizations need to do is forget the business case. Start looking at these hidden costs of things, of revenue that you're losing, people that you're not keeping. And then look at, maybe we're not hiring the best. How much talent money are we leaving on the table because we've got underutilized skill sets, people that are so much better than where they're at, and how much does that cost? The opportunity cost. It's Once you start adding this up, it's so much bigger than the business case the business case is almost always about people being more innovative. You have a more diverse teams, you get new ideas, and yes, that's very important. But you got this huge cost of
Right.
talent sitting there on the table, and people are like, I don't know how to do it because they don't know how to measure it, and
Right.
that's the big problem.
Right. They don't know how to measure it, and they don't realize that they need to measure it. Right. They
Yeah,
think that let's say I'm making 100 million a year. This is what our company is doing, right? So that's great. That's what we want. But not realizing you could be making 150 million, right? If you were putting some of these practices into place. So
exactly.
there's also this unfortunate, as you said, we're starting to think about making teams diverse. So we're getting a lot of pushback now, right, from individuals who say, well, they kind of are looking at things as like a fixed state. It's like,
Exactly.
well, if we give up, give up, I'll use air quotes, right,
Yeah. Yeah.
jobs to non-white men, right, it means that white men aren't going to get hired, right? And that's completely ridiculous because if you grow a business, you are making space for more people, right? As you grow and you have higher revenues, you need to hire more. So you
Exactly.
have to keep hiring. And it's one of the reasons that we have this, this hiring shortage. I'm using air quotes because I get it. There are some specialized industries where, yes, there are some shortages. But there's also some of that has to do with the fact that we are refusing to look at and reevaluate what our hiring criteria is. We are still using outdated methods of
Absolutely.
evaluating candidates, methods from 15, 20 years ago that don't work for today's jobs.
Well, I always think about the idea of it, especially as you get to upper levels. It's about, right, who's in your network. Well, if you've got a homogenous senior leadership team or relatively homogenous, and you ask who, go to your networks, what are they going to do? They're going to go to people like them.
Right.
So that's an example of that outdated approach to it. But also then I also think about, I can't tell you the number of times that I've heard over the last 8 months or a year, we're going to go look at the HBCUs as if, so which is fantastic. I think it's fantastic that they're going there, but that's all the people are doing. Like that's their one go-to. We're going to go to the HBCU. Well, there's a lot of other ways to do it. So for example, everybody's got a local university. So go to the local university and say, look, we will hire 50% of your graduates of your tech stream, your STEM, any of your STEM streams, if you create a program for people of underserved groups. And so we'll hire 50% of those. So just create a program. And you think universities are heck they're going to do that. So in 4 years, you could have a whole stream that's yours. Like people weren't thinking outside the box here.
Right. They're definitely not. And I think too, like you said something that triggered me. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was now. My brain is like Swiss cheese these days.
Too busy,
but,
Stacey. I get it.
but it's around this idea of hiring and going to HBCUs. So I remember because I sometimes tell this story. Kelly was telling me about some individuals that you worked with, right, who went to HBCUs to hire and still came out with white people.
I know. I know. It's
Right?
like, it just makes no sense. I know. It's a hilarious story.
Statistic significance of that, right? Like the probability that you can do that is so, I mean, it just boggles the mind. And every
Yes.
time I think it, or I'm just like, seriously, did that really happen?
Right.
And so to your point, it's not about just going to HBCUs. It's about being intentional about diversity. Because
Exactly.
you can show up to an HBCU and collect resumes. I worked for a company, right, where they would go and do these diversity career fairs, and we
Yeah.
would come back with stacks of resumes, and those stacks of resumes sat in boxes for months.
And they didn't touch them.
Because once they got back to the office, they were too busy to
Yeah.
deal with the resumes that they received, right? So
Yeah.
it's about being intentional. It's not about going everywhere and doing things publicly to make it look like you're doing something. It's about actually
Yes.
having impact, right? If you're going
Yeah.
to go to an HBCU, right, or you're going to go to a community college, right? We
Yeah.
pass over community colleges as if there's something wrong with them, especially in California. I'm in California. I know you're in Boston, but it's like California community college system is awesome.
Yes.
There are so many people that come out of those schools with great skills, and we ignore them.
And
So
we
again,
ignore them.
part of that hidden cost is we are spending. I say they, right? This is what I'm pointing the finger.
Yeah.
They are
Yeah.
spending
Yeah.
tons of dollars on going to all of these Ivy League schools and across the country to all these career fairs when right in your backyard, right, you have
Right there.
people who want to be hired. So
Yeah.
stop
Get it.
spending these large amounts of money flying across the country, going to these college fairs when you do have people right in front of you who are qualified. It
Yeah.
goes back to looking at and revising
Yeah.
the qualifications, right? And having some really tough conversations with hiring managers.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm just looking at the comments, and there's a comment about we can't forget those white men need to be part of this diverse team as well, and I think that's really important. So I was asked to be part of a diversity initiative, and there's hardly it's a team of like 20 people, and it's not diverse at all. It's like it's almost all people of it's actually almost all African American people, and it's like, well, wait a second, that's not diverse either, right? It's like
Right.
you can't have any one group and focus on that. It's got to be diverse for everybody, because that's where you get the diversity of the experience and the perspectives, and then you get some of that cognitive diversity in there. And I think people forget that this is about, so I think I always go back to the fact that if you look at the United States and you think about why is it that we are the highest GDP, and I think, and we're not perfect, and I'm not saying we're perfect, but one of the reasons is that we have such incredible diversity. And although we aren't, we're still learning how to use that diversity. We're better than a lot of other countries at using that diversity really, really effectively. And so as we get better at this is a competitive advantage. And it's not about leaving anybody on the table. One of the things that we talk about is, and I was giving a talk yesterday about this, if we want to think about white men, one of the problems is that white men and managers have not been given any of the skill sets to actually learn how to lead inclusively. So, for example, in some of the research we've done, we found that only 21% of existing managers have the skill sets to lead inclusively. So, for example, facilitating an inclusive discussion.
Right.
That's a skill. And
Right.
not hardly anybody's been taught this skill. In fact, it's
Right.
interesting because at my university at Suffolk, we actually just started teaching this in our MBA
Right.
program, because
Well, and it's not just white men, right?
it's not
So,
just white
and this
men.
is where I do say, like, you can't just say, oh, white men don't know. No, none of us know,
None
right?
of us
None of us
know.
know how to have these conversations. And so that's the thing that we teach is that none of us
Right.
know. And it's not because we're bad people, right? It's not
Yes.
because we're racist or sexist or homophobic or
There no
transphobic or
ist.
any of that. I mean, some people might be, right? But
Yes.
in this instance, it's not because of that. It's because we're not taught how. Our
Exactly.
communication skills suck. They're
Right.
just awful. Our emotional intelligence is low, and our self awareness also low. And
Right.
so, and then we take people who are really great at their job and we put them into a managerial role, right? And we don't give them any training on how to be a leader. So that's
Exactly.
also why we have this idea that people leave managers, not companies, right? And
Yep.
so it's because usually the manager doesn't know what they're doing. And so companies have got to be better. And we say this all the time. We'll come in and they want us to do all these DEI things. And I'm like,
Right.
okay, that's great, but can we start with like just some foundational leadership training, leadership development? Could we start there? Because I can
Exactly.
come in and talk to you about empathy and about, opening up your networks and about the cycle of socialization and all these things.
Exactly.
But if you don't know how to have a conversation with your direct report and how to give
Right.
proper feedback, these other things are not going to be helpful to you. These are tools you will
Exactly.
not be able to use.
It's foundational skills. I tell the story. It's like if you have two people arguing and you've never taught them how to argument, what's going to happen is they're just going to yell louder. It's just
Right,
going to escalate the whole thing because they don't have the skills. It's not because they're bad people, because they don't know how to do it. And this is just like, but I do think that it's really important. I mean, we always talk about mindset, skill set, and then the process piece. And one of the things that we say is that it can't just be skills focused. And I know you and I have talked about this. It's like a lot of companies are doing what I consider check the box. Let's do unconscious bias training for everybody, but then there's no support afterwards. There's no place for people to actually practice the skills because the organization still operates in the same way. And
right,
so you've got to change the mindset so that people are more open to having the diversity piece, give them the skills to manage it, and then change the processes to support it. So you need all three for this.
right,
And I
right.
think
And
it's so
it's
fascinating.
Yeah, well, and because everyone says, oh, unconscious bias training doesn't work. I mean, literally, if you Google, does unconscious bias training work, you'll get a plethora of, of articles that say, no, it's terrible. We should stop doing it. And I'm always like, you know what? I agree. Because the problem is that, like you just said, we do unconscious bias training, and I don't even like the word training. I prefer education, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's education, because we have this unrealistic expectation that someone's going to sit through a 60, 90, or 120-minute session, and they're somehow going to come out
Voila.
changed, right? Like you put them into some kind of machine, and it changes, how they're going to come out. It's like, on what planet Does that
Exactly.
even make sense that you would have the expectation that people are going to take a one-time session and are going to come out different? The idea, and I literally just
Yeah.
wrote this in a article what I'm
Yeah.
doing for chief talent learning officers, right, for ATD. The idea, right, that training is going to do that is crazy because
It's
we
crazy.
have to set the right expectation. And so
Yep.
the unconscious bias education that we do, it's not about changing, the behavior today. It's about giving people the awareness that behavior needs to change
Yeah. We
because
always
many people aren't even aware,
Many people
right?
aren't not even aware. And like one of the tools that we try to teach in our unconscious bias training is this idea of look for the assumptions. Like test it out, like look and see, like be an observer, be a scientist. Go out and be a scientist and check and see what is happening. What are you noticing? Like, for example, go into a meeting and just observe and say, who's talking? Who's not talking? Who's being talked over? And how are decisions being made? Be a scientist and then say, okay, what are all the different assumptions that are happening here? And then you can start to about these assumptions. We call it reframing. How might you look at it differently so that then you can actually make some change? But if you just go in there and say, well, I'm powerful, I'm the one running this meeting, so therefore I have to do it this way. Well, there's a huge assumption about leadership right there. And is it true? Is that really the
Right,
most effective way to lead? Actually, it's not. And all tons of research talks about that. I think so much of this is because we go in there with a lack of awareness, and what we need to start to do, and this is an essential leadership skill to your point, we need to actually start being a little more reflective and saying, what is actually happening here? It's
right.
interesting.
Right. And I see a question from Crystal. She says, how do you incorporate any kind of DEI work in an organization that wants to avoid targeting identity groups? I'm trying to figure out if I understand. Are you saying so? I think I'll say it in a general way because I'm not
Yeah.
sure if I quite understand the question. But I think if you want to avoid targeting identity groups, right, it's really first of all not expecting that specific identity groups are going to be the ones that are going to lead the charge for DEI, right?
Yes.
How many organizations are reaching out to their employee resource groups and expecting them to do the work or
For
don't
for
have employee
volunteer, by the
resource
way.
groups? Right,
Volunteer.
right.
You don't get a budget for that. Oh, you will pay for food though.
Right, right. Or that they don't even have, employee resource groups. So they decide that, well, let's start there. Let's create an employee resource group. And it's good, right? You need them, but you've got to ask yourself, what is the purpose, right? I'm constantly asking the question, what is your purpose? What is your why? Give me an answer for this, please.
Exactly.
Because we want to dive in and do all of these things. And it's what we talk about in the book. I should grab my book. I don't even know where it is. Here it is. There we go. Unbiased, right? Addressing unconscious bias at work. We talk about starting with awareness, not with
Exactly.
action,
Yes.
because
Got
we've
to.
got to start thinking about what is it that we actually need, right? What is it that we are trying to do? Who are we trying to do it for? And then we can start to get into some alignment of,
Yes.
you know, making sure that leaders understand that process. So just,
And
starting with awareness is huge. I'm always
absolutely.
talking about awareness.
And to build on your point, Stacey, I think the other piece is that we also have to start with our own awareness. It's like, how are we contributing to this? Like a lot of our stuff that we've done is we look at a lot of the assumptions that people, so what in the socialization process, oftentimes we swallow these assumptions whole. And that's what threat comes in, like which has been extremely well researched, but all you have to do is remind somebody of their race or gender, and then they'll diminish their self. There's this great study where they did this, I took this math test, and it was a group of Asian women. So for one group, they asked what their ethnicity was. For another group, they asked what their gender was. And for another group, they didn't ask any question. And this was the first question of the math test. So the Asian group was reminded of the Asian stereotype that Asians are supposedly good in math. So they did the best of all. The ones that were reminded of their gender did the worst because girls aren't supposed to be good at math, even though I know a heck of a lot of girls that are incredible at math. And then the group that they didn't ask anything was sort of in the middle. All they had to do was remind people of the stereotype, and then the respondent
Right.
reacted in this way.
You start to embody that,
You
right? You
embody
start
it.
to,
So you've got to have that internal reflection too. It's like, hold on. You got to stop this. You've got to be aware of how you're internalizing the stereotype. So you got to look at how others are enforcing that stereotype on you. And then you got to look at how those stereotypes have been built into the system. And let me give you a quick example on that. So we worked with this one organization, and they had this get together with all their new hires or potential new hires. And it was a social situation where they were basically supposed to network. So now I want you to imagine that people who had not grown up in a socioeconomic class or in a background where that was the norm, they didn't know what the rules were, or if they were an introvert. So it totally biased towards anybody that was comfortable in that situation, which tends to be people in higher socioeconomic classes, and anybody who's an extrovert who feels comfortable. And then all the people that didn't do well in that social situation, they sort of like there's SOL. Like, because what are you going to do? And so then they hired based on that. And I'm like, hold on. And they didn't even realize how that bias was built into the process itself. It was hidden.
Right. And so that's, brings us full circle, right? We're talking about hidden bias. And then, so just to kind of wrap this and go back to hidden costs, I think that it is, well, before I even do that, let me just say, I have your book up on the screen here. And so your book, The Next Smart Step, is talking about overcoming gender stereotypes, right? So give us a quick synopsis. What are people going to get out of it?
So we really organized the book. And by the way, that what we talk about, we have a gender lens because that's what the publisher asked us to do. But what we really try to do is say we want to go above all these diversity aspects and say this is about rethinking it at a higher level. And the higher level is really this mindset, skill set, and process piece. So part of the book is really about identifying all the assumptions that have been baked into people based on gender. And then we introduce this tool of how do we reframe it? How do we look at these and really test these assumptions, identify them, and then look at them differently? So for example, the example that I gave of, girls aren't supposed to be good at math, even though if we look historically, like girls aren't supposed to be good at programming, so we don't want to hire girls. So we actually look at this and test that assumption because historically, actually, women were the programmers. And so if we actually look at it from a bigger perspective, we can now rethink this completely. And then the last piece is the assumptions that we've built and baked into our processes and how we need to really rethink all the different ways that we hire people or sponsor people. And we have a whole we have a scorecard where we look at all the 12 different areas of how these assumptions have been baked into our processes. And then in every step of the way, we give people the tool and the toolkits to actually overcome this.
Yeah, no, that is great. So you can get her book. I've dropped it into the chat as well. It may or may not show up on LinkedIn. It shows up on Facebook. So we're also live on Facebook, but it's on the screen as well so that you can get that information. I see a question in here that says, would you say a lot of resources required to do DEI properly? And I think the answer is yes, right? To an extent. I think the issue that we have, and I started actually a group of people who were talking about this, is the fact that there are no real standards for DEI. So it's one of the reasons I personally believe we have, there's a ton of reasons, but one of the reasons, right, that we have problems seeing progress is because we don't have standards. Yes. So when you can just tap anybody on the head in your company and say, oh, we want you to lead DEI, that's a problem. When you can just start a initiative and you really don't have any underlying tools or guidance for what it should look like, that's a problem, right? When you can just reach out to somebody on the internet who says, hey, I'm a DEI expert, and you really don't have any real information about what they've done, who they've done it for, that's also a problem.
You're putting out the shack, putting out the little sign. That's what I always talk about.
Yeah, and so I think that we need to start looking at creating guidelines that can be, universally looked at and can be reviewed and can be used, because this is something that we see is problematic. So in my book on bias, addressing unconscious bias at work, it's based upon 4 phases of the framework, and really starting with, like I said, awareness, alignment, action, advocacy. But people want to start with action. You will notice that action is the 3rd step. Yes. It is not the first. and it is set that way for a reason. So I also see there's a question asking about recording. Yes, this is recorded, so it'll be on my feed. Jodi will post it on her feed. If you are not following us, please do. And that way you will be able to go back and watch this again later. So any closing thoughts that you might have for us, Jodi?
Yeah, I think the key thing is, and I think this builds on the question about resources to require to really doing DEI. The way I always look at it is that, when we have a new product or service, whether you're a nonprofit, a government, or a for-profit organization, you put money into the strategy. You make it a strategic priority and you put your best people on it, you give it a budget. But when people think of DEI, it's like an add-on. Oh, and we do DEI. Oh, and we do that. Well, it's, to me, because of the talent costs that's being left on the table that we started off our conversation with, this needs to be a strategic initiative. And that means you put real money on it and you put real effort in it, and it's led by the senior executives of the organization, and it becomes embedded in what you do, and you measure the progress. That's where I think the impact's going to have. As long as it becomes an initiative or the chief learning officer to have to just train everybody in unconscious bias training, there's not going to be progress in that organization. So
Exactly.
action is strategy level, strategic priority.
Yes. So we are talking about embedding it, right, into the strategy that you already have. And so knowing what that strategy is and how DEI gets layered into it, not added on as a separate thing. So that is the suggestion from us today. And we hope that you enjoyed this. And like I said, you'll have the opportunity to be able to rewatch it. So thank you very much. And we
Thanks,
will
Stacey.
see you again soon.
Bye, everybody.